The crystal chandeliers of the Morgan and Reed Investment Bank's Grand Hall sparkled like frozen tears as Isabella Mitchell stood before the board of directors, her heart pounding against her cream silk blouse. At 32, she had climbed from junior analyst to executive vice president through sheer determination and brilliant financial strategies. Today should have been her crowning achievement, the presentation of her revolutionary market analysis that could save the company millions. Ms. Mitchell, Richard Morgan III's voice cut through the tension like an icy blade. His steel gray eyes, so much like his father's, held none of the warmth she'd once known. Would you care to explain these discrepancies? Isabella's blood ran cold as she watched him project a series of doctored spreadsheets onto the screen behind her. The numbers were all wrong, completely different from the ones she'd prepared. Her gaze darted to Thomas Reed, her mentor of 10 years, seeking support. But his face was a mask of practiced disappointment. These aren't my figures, she managed, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. There must be some mistake. The only mistake, Richard continued, rising from his leather chair, was trusting a girl from the wrong side of Brooklyn to handle such sensitive information. The board has evidence that you've been selling our trading strategies to competitors. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Around the mahogany table, board members shook their heads, their faces a mixture of disgust and feigned sadness. Only Sandra Chen, the newest board member, seemed genuinely troubled by the proceedings. This is absurd. Isabella protested, reaching for her laptop. I can prove. Security has already cleaned out your office, Thomas Reed interrupted, not meeting her eyes. Your credentials have been revoked. The police are waiting in the lobby. Isabella's world spun as two security guards appeared at her sides. Through the glass walls, she could see her team, people she'd mentored and supported, turning away from the spectacle. All except young Mike Peterson, her assistant, who looked on with tears in his eyes. Why, she whispered, looking directly at Richard Morgan III. They'd grown up together in the company, shared lunches, celebrated victories. She'd even attended his wedding last year. His smile was cold as winter. Because, my dear Isabella, you forgot your place. Did you really think they'd let someone like you take control of the Morgan legacy? The board would never accept it. As security escorted her through the marble lobby, past shocked faces and whispered conversations, Isabella caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished doors. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, Mitchell women don't break, baby. We bend, we adapt, but we never break. Outside, reporters were already gathering, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Headlines would scream about the fall of Isabella Mitchell, the golden girl of Wall Street, but they didn't know what she knew. This wasn't the end of her story. In her apartment that evening, as rain pelted against the windows of her Upper East Side sanctuary, Isabella sat in darkness, surrounded by the life she'd built. Photos of her graduation from Columbia Business School, awards for financial excellence, and memories of a decade of dedication stared back at her. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Not everything is as it seems. Meet me tomorrow, 7 a.m., Central Park, Bethesda Fountain. Come alone. S. Thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline as Isabella stood and walked to the window. Below, the city lights flickered like stars fallen to earth. She thought of her mother, who'd worked 3 jobs to put her through school, of the projects where she'd learned to be tough, and of all the people who'd said she'd never make it. You want to bury me, she whispered to her reflection, her jaw set with determination. Then you better dig deep, because I'm not just going to survive this, I'm going to make you regret the day you chose me as your target. The storm outside intensified, but in that moment, something shifted within Isabella Mitchell. The same fire that had carried her from Brooklyn to the boardroom began to burn again, stronger than before. They had taken her reputation, her position, and her dreams, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. Sometimes, the seeds you try to bury turn out to be the ones that grow into something unstoppable. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the first step of her journey back to the top. But this time, she wouldn't be climbing alone, and the view from the summit would be very different indeed. Dawn painted Central Park in shades of gold as Isabella Mitchell approached the Bethesda Fountain. Her designer heels, once symbols of her success, clicked softly against the damp pavement. She'd barely slept, spending the night analyzing every moment that led to her downfall. The morning newspapers had been merciless. Wall Street Wonder Woman caught in corporate espionage scandal blazed across the New York Times financial section. The angel statue loomed above her, its wings spread in eternal blessing over the empty plaza. A solitary figure sat on a nearby bench, Sandra Chen, the newest board member, feeding pigeons with practiced nonchalance. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Sandra said without looking up. "Sit. Don't make it obvious we're talking." Isabella settled beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "You're taking a risk being seen with me. They're monitoring your usual contacts, but not me." "Not yet." Sandra tossed another handful of breadcrumbs. "What do you know about Project Phoenix?" The name triggered a memory, a file glimpsed on Thomas Reed's desk months ago, quickly covered when she'd entered his office. "Nothing concrete. High-level meetings, coded memos." "It's a hostile takeover," Sandra revealed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Morgan and Reed are orchestrating the biggest financial coup in decades. They're targeting Chen Global Industries, my family's company." Isabella's mind raced. Chen Global was a technological powerhouse, pioneering green energy solutions across Asia and Europe. "But you're on the board. Unless they needed someone to take the fall when the plan goes south." Sandra's perfectly manicured nails dug into the paper bag of breadcrumbs. "Your analysis would have exposed the manipulation. They needed you gone before you connected the dots." A jogger passed by, and both women fell silent. Isabella watched the fountain's waters cascade, remembering countless lunch breaks spent here, dreaming of her future. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my father built Chen Global from nothing, just like you built your career. I won't let them destroy either." Sandra slipped a USB drive into Isabella's coat pocket. "Everything's here, the real numbers, recorded conversations, money trails. But I can't move against them directly. As far as they know, I'm the obedient daughter playing at business in America. If I use this information, they'll know it came from you. Not if we play it right." Sandra stood, smoothing her designer suit. "There's someone else you need to meet. Tonight, 8 p.m., Sullivan's Diner in Brooklyn. Ask for Jimmy at the counter." "And Isabella?" Their eyes met. "Trust no one else." As Sandra walked away, Isabella's phone buzzed. A text from her younger sister, Grace, "Big sis, saw the news. Mom would have fought back. Remember what she always said about storms?" The memory washed over her, sitting on their cramped apartment's fire escape during a summer thunderstorm, her mother's arms around both sisters. "The bigger the storm," she'd say, "the stronger the tree grows, if it's got deep enough roots." Isabella made her way to Brooklyn, to the neighborhood she'd fought so hard to leave behind. The familiar streets felt different now, not a reminder of what she'd escaped, but of the strength she'd forged here. Outside her old apartment building, Mrs. Rodriguez, their former neighbor, was sweeping the stoop. "Mira quienes," the elderly woman exclaimed. "Our Wall Street girl. I saw what they're saying about you. Mentiras, all lies. I remember when you used to help my Miguel with his math homework. A good heart doesn't turn bad, no matter how high it climbs." Fighting tears, Isabella hugged her. The simple faith of someone who'd known her before designer suits and corner offices felt like a lifeline. In her sister's small flower shop a few blocks away, Grace was arranging roses with the same determination their mother had shown in everything she did. "Those vultures think they can break you?" Grace snorted, pushing her wild curls back. "They don't know Mitchell women." "I need your help, Gracie," Isabella said, settling on a wooden stool. "But it could get complicated." "Complicated?" Grace laughed, her brown eyes sparkling with their mother's fire. "Complicated was raising 2 girls on a housekeeper's salary. Complicated was you working 3 jobs to put yourself through Columbia while helping me with my nursing degree. This is just another storm to weather." Isabella shared Sandra's revelations, watching her sister's expression shift from anger to calculated determination. Grace had always been the fighter of the family, quick to defend and slow to forgive. "Miguel Rodriguez works IT at Morgan and Reed now," Grace mentioned, a sly smile forming. "Remember how you used to tutor him? He owes you. And he sees everything that goes through those servers. The pieces were beginning to align, like a complex financial algorithm finally revealing its pattern. Isabella thought of Richard Morgan III's smug face, of Thomas Reed's betrayal, of all the whispers behind her back about the scholarship girl who dared to rise above her station. "They thought they were burying me," Isabella said, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "But they forgot what happens when you bury a seed in fertile ground." Grace grinned, fierce and proud. "It grows into something they never saw coming." As evening approached, Isabella prepared for her meeting at Sullivan's Diner. The USB drive felt heavy in her pocket, weighted with possibilities and dangers. Her phone buzzed again, a news alert about Morgan and Reed's stock jumping 5 points after her departure. They thought they were celebrating their victory. But Isabella Mitchell knew better. In Brooklyn streets, among the people who'd shaped her, she felt her roots growing deeper, stronger. The storm hadn't destroyed her, it had only scattered seeds of her strength across fertile ground. And from those seeds, an army would grow. She stepped into the gathering dusk, her designer heels replaced with practical flats, her silk blouse exchanged for a simple sweater. Tonight, she wasn't the fallen Wall Street executive. She was her mother's daughter, a Mitchell woman, and the real battle was just beginning. The neon lights of Sullivan's Diner beckoned ahead, promising answers and allies. Behind her, Manhattan's towers gleamed like false gods in the distance, unaware that their foundations were about to be shaken by the very woman they'd tried to destroy. Sullivan's Diner looked frozen in time, its chrome fixtures and red vinyl booths unchanged since Isabella's childhood. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, carrying memories of late-night study sessions fueled by coffee and dreams of escape. "Jimmy," she asked the elderly man behind the counter, who nodded toward a booth in the back. There, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, sat the last person she expected to see, Christopher Morgan, Richard Morgan III's younger brother and the family's black sheep. "Hello, Bella," he said, using her old nickname from their college days at Columbia. His once rebellious appearance had matured into calculated casualness, but his eyes still held that dangerous spark. "Rough day at the office?" Isabella slid into the booth, studying the man she'd once considered a close friend before family obligations had pulled them apart. "Did Sandra send you?" "Sandra?" Chris laughed softly. "No, though I'm not surprised she's involved. We've all got reasons to want to see my dear brother fall." He pushed a coffee toward her. "Black, 2 sugars, you haven't changed." "You disappeared 3 years ago," Isabella said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Everyone said you'd gone to Europe. That's what Richard wanted them to think. Truth is, I've been right here in New York, gathering evidence." Chris leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You remember why I left the company?" Isabella nodded. Chris had been set to take over the family's charitable foundation until he'd discovered irregularities in the books. The foundation had collapsed shortly after his departure, taking millions in donations with it. "What I found wasn't just creative accounting," Chris continued. "It was a pattern. Richard and Reed have been using the bank to orchestrate corporate takeovers for years. They target family-owned companies, manipulate their stock, and then swoop in to save them, for pennies on the dollar. Shen Global is their next target," Isabella filled in, connecting the dots. "Their biggest yet. But they needed someone with your expertise out of the way. You would have seen through their manipulation of the markets." Chris pulled out a leather portfolio. "Remember Professor Martinez from Columbia? He's been helping me track their activities. The patterns are there if you know where to look." Isabella's mind raced through years of transactions she'd overseen. The Westbrook manufacturing collapse last year wasn't a collapse at all. They're still operating, just under a Morgan subsidiary now. Chris spread out documents showing a complex web of shell companies and transactions. But Shen Global is different. Sandra's father has political connections in Asia that could expose everything if the takeover goes wrong. That's why they needed a scandal, Isabella realized. A disgraced executive selling secrets would explain any leaked information about their strategies. The diner's door chimed again. Mike Peterson, Isabella's former assistant, walked in, looking nervous but determined. Chris nodded to him. "Mike's been our eyes inside since you hired him." Richard never thought to question the background of a junior assistant. Mike slid into the booth beside Chris. Ms. Mitchell, I'm so sorry I couldn't warn you. But we've got something big. Tomorrow morning, Richard's meeting with the Chun Global Board in Singapore via video conference. He doesn't know we've got access to the secure feed. Thanks to Miguel Rodriguez, Isabella smiled, thinking of Grace's revelation about their old neighbor. The IT system's compromised. We need to move fast, Chris urged. Once Richard announces the irregularities they've manufactured in Chen Global's books, their stock will plummet. They've already positioned their shell companies to buy up shares. Isabella pulled out Sandra's USB drive. Then let's see what we're really dealing with. Mike produced a laptop, and for the next hour, they pored over documents, connecting threads that painted a picture of breathtaking corruption. But something wasn't adding up. These dates, Isabella murmured, pointing to a series of transactions. They align perfectly with Thomas Reed's personal trading patterns. Her heart sank as she recognized the betrayal went even deeper. He's been positioning himself to betray Richard too. Classic Reed, Chris snorted. He did the same thing to my father before he died. Always playing both sides. A text message lit up Isabella's phone. Grace, got something. Meet me at Mom's old place. Now. I have to go, Isabella stood, gathering the documents. Mike, can you get me access to tomorrow's video conference? Already done. 9 a.m. sharp. Chris caught her arm as she turned to leave. Bella, be careful. Richard may seem like the villain here, but Reed, he's the real snake. He's got dirt on everyone, and he's not afraid to use it. Outside, Brooklyn's streets were quiet, but Isabella's mind was a storm of activity. She'd spent years learning the intricacies of high finance, but she'd forgotten the most important lesson her mother taught her: sometimes the simplest solutions come from the heart. Grace was waiting at their old apartment building, now owned by a developer who'd left it to decay while waiting for property values to rise. In the dim hallway, her sister's face glowed with triumph. Remember Mrs. Reed's diamond necklace? Grace asked without preamble. Isabella frowned. The one that was stolen at the company Christmas party 5 years ago? What about it? Wasn't stolen. Grace pulled out her phone, showing a video. Mrs. Rodriguez's cousin still works maintenance there. Look what she found while cleaning Reed's office last night. The grainy security footage showed Thomas Reed himself planting the necklace in a junior employee's locker, an employee who'd been fired and charged with theft. He's been doing it for years, Grace continued. Setting people up, destroying careers, all to cover his tracks. But he kept trophies. She produced a small notebook. His wife's personal diary. She wrote down everything before she died last year. Guess who was holding on to it? Mrs. Rodriguez, Isabella breathed. The old neighbor who'd welcomed her home that morning had been sitting on a goldmine of evidence. Turns out Reed's been playing everyone, Richard Morgan, the board, even his own family. And now we can prove it. Isabella stared out the grimy window at Manhattan's glittering skyline. Tomorrow morning, Richard Morgan would try to destroy another family's legacy. But he didn't know what was coming. Because while he and Reed had been playing chess with people's lives, they'd forgotten that sometimes the most dangerous pieces on the board are the ones you've already sacrificed. Grace, Isabella said slowly, a plan forming. How many of Reed's victims can you find before morning? Her sister's smile was fierce in the darkness. Already on it. Mrs. Rodriguez has been making calls all day. Turns out, people who've been wronged have long memories, and they're ready for justice. As she made her way back to her apartment, Isabella's phone buzzed one last time. A message from Sandra, everything's set in Singapore. Dad knows the truth. Are you ready? Isabella looked at her reflection in a passing store window. She saw her mother's determination, her sister's fire, and her own hard-won wisdom. Ready, she typed back. Tell your father to watch tomorrow's meeting very carefully. It's time to show them what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman. The night stretched ahead, full of preparations to make and allies to coordinate. But for the first time since her world had collapsed, Isabella felt truly powerful. Not because of her position or her knowledge of finance, but because she remembered who she was, a Mitchell woman, forged in Brooklyn streets, tempered by adversity, and now ready to rise from the ashes they'd tried to bury her in. tomorrow would change everything. And this time, she would make sure the change was permanent. The morning sun had barely touched Manhattan's towers when Isabella entered her old office building through the service entrance, dressed in the maintenance staff's navy uniform. Mrs. Rodriguez's cousin, Maria, had arranged everything perfectly. The security cameras would show only static for the next 15 minutes, courtesy of Miguel's careful programming. Remember, Grace's voice came through her hidden earpiece, "You've got exactly 12 minutes before the video conference starts." Mike's got the feed ready to broadcast everything to all floors. Isabella moved swiftly through the familiar corridors, now eerily empty in the pre-work hours. Her heart thundered against her ribs as she approached Thomas Reed's office. The security panel blinked green, Miguel's handiwork again, and she slipped inside. The office still smelled of Reed's expensive cologne and leather furniture. How many careers had been destroyed in this room? How many lives ruined by the man who'd mentored her, only to orchestrate her downfall? Inside his desk, third drawer, Chris Morgan's voice joined Grace's in the earpiece. "The false bottom holds his private ledger. Richard never knew about it, but I saw Reed updating it once before I left." Isabella's fingers found the catch, revealing a leather-bound book filled with Reed's meticulous handwriting. Names, dates, transactions, a detailed record of every betrayal, every manipulation, every life he'd destroyed to maintain his power. "Got it," she whispered, photographing each page with the miniature camera Sandra had provided. Starting phase 2. She moved to Reed's computer, inserting the flash drive Mike had prepared. Years of working alongside Reed meant she knew his patterns, including his habit of using his wife's birthday as his password. The screen came to life, and Isabella's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Incoming," Grace warned. Reed's car just pulled up outside. Isabella's pulse quickened, but she didn't stop. "Nearly done. Is everyone in position?" "All 23 of Reed's former victims are in the lobby," Grace confirmed. "Mrs. Rodriguez is keeping them calm. Channel 7 news van is coincidentally parked outside for a story about downtown traffic. Sandra says her father and the Chun Global Board are ready," Chris added. "They're logging into the video conference now." The sound of voices in the corridor forced Isabella to move faster. She completed the file transfer, removed the drive, and slipped into Reed's private bathroom just as he entered the office. Through the crack in the door, she watched him prepare for what he thought would be his moment of triumph. "Everything ready for the meeting?" Richard Morgan III's voice came through Reed's speakerphone. "Of course," Reed replied smoothly, adjusting his tie in the reflection of his window. "By noon, Chun Global stock will be in freefall. Our shells are ready to buy at 30% of current value." "Perfect. And no traces leading back to us?" "Please," Reed chuckled. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, Richard. Everyone will be too busy talking about poor Isabella Mitchell's spectacular fall from grace to notice anything else." Isabella's fists clenched at the casual cruelty in his voice. In her ear, Grace whispered, 2 minutes to conference time. "Get ready." The office filled with the soft hum of Reed's video conference system powering up. On the massive screen, faces began appearing: Richard Morgan III, the Morgan and Reed board members, and the Chun Global executives in Singapore. "Gentlemen," Reed began, his voice dripping with fake concern, "I've called this emergency meeting because we've discovered some deeply troubling irregularities in Chun Global's quarterly reports." "Now," Chris commanded. Isabella pressed a button on her phone. Instantly, Reed's presentation was replaced by security footage, images of him planting evidence, making secret deals, destroying documents. His own voice played over the footage, crystal clear from recordings made by his victims over the years. "What the hell?" Reed stabbed at his controls, but nothing responded. "Looking for these?" Isabella stepped out of her hiding place, holding up the flash drive. "Or maybe you'd prefer we discuss your private ledger? The one detailing every crime you've committed against your own company?" Reed's face went from red to white in seconds. "Security," he bellowed. "They're a bit busy," Isabella smiled. "You see, there are 23 people in the lobby right now, people whose lives you destroyed. People with stories to tell. And look who else is here." The door opened to reveal Chris Morgan, flanked by 2 FBI agents. "Hello, Thomas. It's been a while." On the screen, Richard Morgan III was shouting, his face contorted with rage. "Reed! What have you done?" "Only what you taught him, Richard," Sandra Chen's voice cut through the chaos. The camera panned to show her standing beside her father in Singapore. "Or should we discuss Project Phoenix? The hostile takeover plans? The manufactured evidence against Isabella?" "It's over," Isabella declared, moving to stand directly in front of Reed's desk. "Every transaction, every fake document, every destroyed career, it's all coming out. Right now, across every screen in this building, on live television, and directly to all your shareholders." Reed lunged for his desk drawer, where Isabella knew he kept a gun, but Chris was faster. The FBI agents had him in handcuffs before his fingers could touch the handle. "Thomas Reed," one agent began, "you're under arrest for securities fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." As Reed was led away, still protesting, Isabella turned to face the screen. Richard Morgan III stared back, his face ashen. "You won't get away with this," he snarled. "I already have," Isabella replied calmly. "Check your stock prices, Richard. While you've been sitting here, evidence of your involvement in Project Phoenix has been released to every major financial news outlet. Morgan & Reed stock has dropped 60% in the last 5 minutes. But that's not the best part," Chris added, stepping into view. "The board voted 10 minutes ago. They're removing you as CEO, brother. Something about bringing the company into disrepute." Richard's scream of rage was cut off as his video feed went dark. One by one, the board members disconnected, leaving only the Chen Global executives. "Ms. Mitchell," Mr. Chen spoke, his face stern but his eyes twinkling, "I believe we have much to discuss about the future of both our companies. Perhaps you'd consider a position as our American operations director?" Isabella felt tears threatening but held them back. "I'd be honored, Mr. Chen. But first, there are some people downstairs who deserve to have their stories heard. And their careers restored." As she left Reed's office for the last time, Isabella heard the commotion from the lobby, cheers, cries, and the unmistakable sound of justice being served. Grace was waiting by the elevators, grinning from ear to ear. "Mom would be so proud," her sister said, pulling her into a fierce hug. Isabella held on tight, thinking of their mother's words about storms and strength. The storm had come, just as predicted, but it hadn't destroyed her. Instead, it had revealed just how deep her roots really went, and how many people were willing to stand beside her when it mattered most. "This isn't over yet," Chris warned, joining them. "Richard won't go down without a fight." Isabella straightened her shoulders, ready for whatever came next. "Good," she said, stepping into the elevator. "Because neither will I." As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of her reflection, no longer the polished executive, not quite the Brooklyn girl she'd once been, but something new, a woman who discovered that true power comes not from position or wealth, but from the strength of the connections we forge and the truth we're willing to fight for. The revolution she'd started was just beginning, and this time, she had an army at her back. 3 weeks after Thomas Reed's arrest, Isabella sat in her new corner office at Chen Global's Manhattan headquarters, watching rain trace patterns on the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was different from her old office. Instead of looking down at Wall Street, she now faced Central Park, its autumn colors muted by the storm. "The latest numbers from the SEC investigation," Sandra Chen said, placing a thick folder on Isabella's desk. "They've frozen 19 of Reed's offshore accounts. Richard's too, though he managed to transfer some assets before they could get to everything." Isabella leafed through the documents, her expression grim. "He's planning something. Richard doesn't lose quietly. That's why you need to see this." Sandra produced a tablet showing surveillance photos. Richard was spotted meeting with James Blackwood yesterday. The name sent a chill down Isabella's spine. James Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Financial, was known as the Undertaker for his specialty in hostile takeovers that left companies stripped to the bone. He was also Richard Morgan III's former roommate at Yale. "They're coming after Chen Global," Isabella realized. This isn't just about revenge anymore. Richard's trying to salvage his reputation by proving he was right about the takeover all along. Her phone buzzed with a text from Chris, "Emergency. Meet me at Sullivan's. Now." "Go," Sandra urged. "I'll handle the board meeting this afternoon." The rain had intensified by the time Isabella reached Brooklyn. Sullivan's diner was nearly empty, save for Chris Morgan sitting in their usual booth, looking more disheveled than usual. "Richard's been busy," he said without preamble, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Remember Caroline Walker?" Isabella's heart sank. Caroline had been Richard's executive assistant for 15 years before mysteriously resigning last year. "What about her?" "She didn't resign. Richard forced her out after she discovered Project Phoenix's early planning stages. But before she left," Chris tapped the envelope, "she made copies. Lots of copies. Inside were documents dating back 5 years, detailed plans showing how Richard and Reed had systematically targeted family-owned companies across the country. But something else caught Isabella's eye, her own name, appearing in notes from 3 years ago. "They've been planning my downfall since I made executive VP," she whispered, anger and hurt warring in her chest. "Richard recommended me for the position. He promoted me just to set me up." "There's more," Chris said softly. "Look at the last page." It was a photograph, faded but clear enough. In it, Richard Morgan II, Chris and Richard III's father, stood beside Isabella's mother in a hospital corridor. The date stamp showed it was taken 2 days before the elder Morgan's death. "I don't understand," Isabella began, but Chris cut her off. "Dad tried to change his will at the end. He wanted to leave a significant portion of his shares to your mother, and to you and Grace. Richard III found out and..." The diner's door chimed. Grace burst in, her nurse's scrubs still on, her face pale. "Bella, you need to come home. Now. Mrs. Rodriguez, she's been attacked." The next hour was a blur of sirens and hospital corridors. Mrs. Rodriguez lay in the emergency room, her small frame looking fragile against the white sheets. The police officer taking her statement looked grim. "2 men," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice weak but determined. "They wanted Reed's wife's diary. Said they'd come back if I didn't tell them where it was." "Blackwood's men," Chris growled. "Richard's getting desperate." Isabella held Mrs. Rodriguez's hand, fury building in her chest. "I'm moving you somewhere safe. All of you, everyone who helped us expose Reed." "No, mi hija," Mrs. Rodriguez smiled faintly. "We don't hide. Your madre taught you better than that." Grace, who'd been checking Mrs. Rodriguez's vitals, suddenly straightened. "Bella, remember what Mom used to say about cockroaches?" Isabella frowned, then understanding dawned. Their mother, working as a housekeeper in luxury buildings, had always said that cockroaches weren't the real problem, they were just symptoms of deeper issues. The diary was never the real evidence, Isabella realized. Mrs. Reed knew that. She was leaving breadcrumbs, leading us to something bigger. Chris's phone chimed with an alert. His face went slack as he read it. Richards called an emergency shareholders meeting for Morgan and Reed. He's claiming to have evidence that Dad was mentally incompetent when he made his last business decisions. He's trying to invalidate everything, including Dad's last attempts to stop Project Phoenix. Then we need to find what Mrs. Reed was really trying to show us, Isabella declared. She turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. The diary entries, they weren't just about Reed's schemes, were they? They were about meetings, places. The elderly woman's eyes twinkled despite her pain. "Marina, my cousin who cleans Reed's office? She doesn't just clean his office. For 20 years, she cleaned Richard Morgan II's office too. And Richard II, he kept everything." Grace pulled out her phone, fingers flying over the screen. "The old Morgan building. The one they abandoned after the merger. Marina says the basement storage was never properly cleared out." Isabella stood, decision made. "Chris, stay with Mrs. Rodriguez. Grace, call Mike, we need those building plans. Sandra needs to know what's happening too." She paused, looking at her reflection in the hospital window. In it, she saw not just herself, but the shadows of all those who'd fought this battle before her mother, Richard Morgan II, Mrs. Reed. "Richard thinks he can erase the past," she said softly. "But some truths refuse to stay buried." As she left the hospital, thunder rolled across Brooklyn. Another storm was coming, But this time Isabella Mitchell wasn't just fighting for her career or her reputation. She was fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been silenced by power and greed. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Ms. Mitchell, James Blackwood would like to meet. Tomorrow, noon. The Harvard Club." Isabella smiled grimly as she typed her response. "Mr. Blackwood, I look forward to it. Although, you might want to ask Richard how his last attempt to intimidate me worked out." The game was changing. Richard had always played by Wall Street rules, where money and power were the only currencies that mattered. But Isabella had learned her lessons in Brooklyn streets, where loyalty and truth were worth more than gold. And she was about to show them all just how powerful those lessons could be. The Harvard Club's mahogany-paneled dining room reeked of old money and privilege. Isabella adjusted her mother's simple gold necklace, her only jewelry, as the maitre d' led her to a corner table where James Blackwood sat waiting. At 60, he remained as imposing as his reputation suggested, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with eyes like frozen steel. "Ms. Mitchell," he rose slightly, gesturing to the empty chair. "I took the liberty of ordering the 82 Bordeaux. I believe it was your mother's favorite." Isabella's step faltered for just a moment. The message was clear: Blackwood had done his homework, and he wanted her to know it. "Actually," she smiled, settling into her chair, "Mom preferred Brooklyn Lager. But then, you'd know that if you'd ever actually met her, instead of just reading a dossier on her." A flicker of appreciation crossed Blackwood's face. "Direct. Good. Then let me be equally direct. Walk away from Chun Global. Whatever they're paying you, I'll double it." "Triple it," a familiar voice interjected. Richard Morgan III appeared, sliding into the third chair uninvited. He looked haggard, his usual polish dimmed by 3 weeks of public humiliation. "Richard," Blackwood sighed, "I thought we agreed I'd handle this privately." "Things change," Richard snapped, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? What my father was trying to do?" Isabella took a slow sip of water, buying time. In her ear, the tiny receiver Grace had insisted she wear crackled to life, mics in the old building's security system. "You've got maybe 20 minutes before someone notices." "Figure what out, Richard?" she asked, keeping his attention. "That your father had a conscience? That he tried to stop you and Reed from destroying people's lives?" "My father," Richard spat, "was a sentimental old fool who let a pretty face cloud his judgment. Just like you're doing now, James." He turned to Blackwood. "Did she tell you about the offshore accounts? The ones she and Sandrich set up?" Blackwood's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly. "I assume you have proof?" "Arriving any moment. My contact at the SEC is very thorough." Isabella's phone buzzed, a text from Chris. "Found it. Dad's private safe. You're not going to believe what's in here." "Interesting timing," Isabella said calmly, though her heart was racing. "While we're on the subject of proof, Richard, would you like to explain these?" She pulled out her tablet, sliding it across the table. On the screen was a series of photographs, Richard Morgan II in various hospitals over his last year, each one showing him alert and sharp as ever, signing documents, meeting with lawyers. "Extensive documentation of your father's mental competency," Isabella explained. "Including 3 separate psychiatric evaluations. All dated after he discovered what you and Reed were planning." Richard's face went pale, then red. "Where did you? The old building?" Isabella smiled. "You really should have cleaned out those storage rooms properly. Your father believed in keeping records. Paper ones. Protected from any digital tampering." "Chris," Richard growled. "Of course. My treacherous brother always did prefer following Dad around like a puppy instead of learning how business really works." "Oh, he learned," Isabella countered. "He learned enough to know that real business isn't about destroying lives for profit. Speaking of which." She turned to Blackwood, whose expression had grown increasingly thoughtful. "Mr. Blackwood, before you consider Richard's proposal, you might want to see what else we found in that storage room. Specifically, files about the Anderson Tech takeover in '98. Blackwood went very still. Anderson Tech had been his first major hostile takeover, the one that earned him his reputation. It had also resulted in 3 suicides among the company's original board members. My father tried to stop that one too, Isabella continued. He kept all the evidence of how it was really done. The forged documents, the planted stories, the paid-off investigators. Enough! Richard slammed his hand on the table, making the water glasses jump. Several heads turned their way. Volume, Richard, Blackwood murmured. Ms. Mitchell, I believe I've misjudged this situation. And you? In Isabella's ear, Grace's voice was triumphant. Got the last box of files. Sandra's lawyers are going through them now. It's all here, Bella. Everything Dad tried to warn Mom about. Isabella stood, smoothing her skirt. Gentlemen, this has been enlightening. Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you reconsider your partnership with Richard. The SEC will be very interested in what we found today. You bitch, Richard snarled, starting to rise. You think you can threaten us? Do you know who we are? Richard, Blackwood's voice cut like a knife, sit down and shut up. He turned to Isabella. Well played, Ms. Mitchell. I assume you have a counter-proposal? Simple, withdraw your support for Richard's takeover attempts. All of them. In return, the Anderson tech files stay buried where they belong, in the past. Blackwood studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You are very much your mother's daughter. And, it seems, Richard Morgan II's true heir in all but blood. What? Richard's shock mirrored Isabella's own. Oh, come now, Blackwood smiled thinly. Surely you've figured it out by now? Why your father spent so much time with Elena Mitchell? Why he tried to change his will? He turned to Richard. Your father had a daughter before he married your mother. One he'd been searching for since his first love disappeared from his life. Rather poetic that she turned out to be the one person capable of stopping your little empire of destruction. Isabella's world tilted on its axis. In her ear, Grace was crying softly. All those years of their mother working in the Morgan building, all those casual encounters that seemed like kindness from an employer. That's why you tried to destroy me, she whispered, staring at Richard. You knew. I suspected. Richard's voice was hollow. Reed confirmed it after Dad died. We couldn't let you stay. You were too much like him, too principled, too determined to do things the right way. Mr. Blackwood, Isabella managed, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, we're done here. Your office will receive the documents detailing our terms within the hour. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Richard? The shareholders meeting tomorrow? Don't bother. The board already has copies of everything we found today. Your father made sure of that, 25 years ago. He just needed someone brave enough to finally use them. The rain had stopped by the time Isabella emerged onto 44th Street. Chris was waiting by a town car, his face showing he already knew. He wanted to tell you himself, Chris said quietly. At the end. That's what the hospital photo was about. But Richard had him moved to a private facility before he could, Isabella finished. Where no one could reach him. They rode in silence back to Brooklyn, to the small flower shop where Grace was waiting with Sandra and Mike. The files from the storage room lay spread across the counter, telling a story of decades of corruption, courage, and secrets. What now? Grace asked, hugging her sister tightly. We're Richard Morgan's half-sisters. That changes things. Isabella touched her mother's necklace, thinking of the strength it had taken for Elena Mitchell to raise 2 daughters alone, knowing who their grandfather was but choosing to build their character instead of their bank accounts. No, she said finally. It doesn't change anything. We are who we've always been, Mitchell women. And we have work to do. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across Brooklyn's familiar streets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Isabella Mitchell had found something more valuable than revenge or even justice. She'd found the truth about where she came from and, more importantly, who she truly was. The storm had passed, but its waters had nourished roots deeper than anyone had imagined. And from those roots, a legacy of integrity would grow, stronger than any fortune or family name. The morning headlines screamed across every financial news outlet: Morgan Empire splits, Richard Morgan 3 steps down amid scandal. Isabella watched the sun rise over Manhattan from her Chen Global office, her mother's diary open on her desk. They'd found it last night, hidden in a false bottom of their old jewelry box, Elena Mitchell's final gift to her daughters. "Your grandfather loved deeply but feared openly," her mother had written. "He gave us a choice: take his name and his money, or keep our freedom. I chose freedom for you, my darlings. Some inheritances are worth more than gold." A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sandra Chen entered, followed by Chris and, surprisingly, James Blackwood. "The board meeting just ended," Sandra announced, her usually composed face bright with triumph. "Richard's out. Completely. And Mr. Blackwood has an interesting proposal." Blackwood settled into a chair, looking almost human in the warm morning light. "Your father, Richard Morgan II, he and I were friends once, before power corrupted our circle. His last request to me was to protect Elena's girl if anything happened to him. I failed in that duty, blinded by profit and old loyalties. And now?" Isabella asked carefully. "Now I'm offering you what should have been yours all along: controlling interest in Blackwood Financial. Merged with your position at Chen Global, it would create a powerful counterweight to what remains of Morgan and Reed." Isabella's phone buzzed, Grace sending her a photo of the latest delivery to her flower shop, a massive arrangement of white roses with a card that read, "For our father's true heir." "The Reed family." "Thomas Reed's wife knew," Chris explained, seeing Isabella's confusion. "That's why she kept the diary, documented everything. She was building a case to protect you, in her own way." "The Reed children want to make amends," Blackwood added. "Their father's arrest has opened their eyes to many things. They're offering to sell their shares in Morgan and Reed to you." Isabella stood, walking to the window. Below, New York was waking up, its streets filling with people chasing their own dreams of success. How many of them, she wondered, knew the true cost of ambition? "Before I answer," she said slowly, "there's something we need to do first." An hour later, they gathered in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. Grace had brought fresh flowers for their mother's grave, and now they stood before a grand mausoleum bearing the Morgan name. "Hello, Dad," Isabella whispered, touching the cold marble. Chris squeezed her shoulder supportively. "He used to come here every Sunday," Chris said softly. "After visiting your mom at the bank. He'd talk about you, how proud he was watching you rise through the ranks on your own merit. He kept a photo of you and Grace in his wallet. Why didn't he just tell us?" Grace asked, wiping tears. "Because he respected Mom's choice," Isabella realized. "And he knew that knowing the truth might change our path, make us rely on the Morgan name instead of building our own strength." "Like Richard did," Chris nodded. "Dad saw what inherited power did to his eldest son. He wanted better for you." Isabella knelt, placing her hand on the cool ground. "I understand now, Dad. And I promise, I'll build something worthy of both my names." Back in her office, Isabella faced Blackwood and Sandra with newfound clarity. "I accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood, with one condition: we use our combined resources to create a foundation. The Elena Mitchell Foundation for Educational Empowerment. Helping others rise through merit, not manipulation." "Richard will hate that," Chris grinned. "Richard will have time to reflect," Blackwood said dryly. "The SEC investigation into his personal dealings isn't going well. And there's another matter." He hesitated. "Your grandmother, Richard Morgan II's first wife, she's alive. Living in a small town in Vermont. She's been following your story and she'd like to meet you." Isabella's heart skipped. Another piece of her history, waiting to be discovered. "But first, Mrs. Rodriguez is being released from the hospital today," she said. "I think it's time we showed our true strength." She turned to Sandra. "How would Chen Global feel about partnering with small, family-owned businesses in Brooklyn? Real investment, not hostile takeovers." Sandra's eyes lit up. "Dad's been talking about expanding our community development program. Starting with your old neighborhood would be perfect." "Count Blackwood Financial in," James nodded. "Time to rebuild some of what we've broken over the years." Grace burst in, waving her phone. "You need to see this." Richard, he's calling a press conference. Right now. They gathered around the TV just as Richard Morgan III approached the podium outside Morgan and Reed's headquarters. He looked broken, his usual arrogance replaced by something that might have been humility. Today, I stand before you not as a Morgan, but as a man who has lost his way, he began, his voice shaking. 25 years ago, my father tried to show me that true legacy isn't built on destroying others, but on lifting them up. I didn't listen. Today, I'm announcing my complete withdrawal from Morgan and Reed, and the donation of my personal fortune to the newly established Isabella Mitchell Foundation. Isabella gasped. Chris whistled low. Well, little brother finally grew a conscience. Or recognized a sinking ship, Blackwood mused. Either way, it's a smart move. The SEC might look more favorably on voluntary restitution. But Isabella saw something else in Richard's face, a glimmer of their father's integrity, fighting to break free from years of corruption. He's choosing to be better, she said softly. Like Dad always hoped he would. Her phone chimed with a message from Richard, can't undo what I did. But I can try to honor both our parents going forward. Coffee sometime? As siblings? Grace read the message over her shoulder and snorted. Make him buy coffee in Brooklyn. See if he's really serious about change. Isabella laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. One bridge at a time, sis. We've got our own empire to build. Looking around the office at her unlikely alliance, Sandra Chen, the loyal friend, Chris Morgan, the brother who chose truth over power, James Blackwood, the reformed corporate raider, and Grace, her constant anchor, Isabella felt the weight of both her inheritances, the Mitchell spirit of perseverance and the Morgan legacy of influence. But unlike Richard, she would use both to build rather than destroy. So, she smiled, was ready to change Wall Street from the inside out. Outside her window, Brooklyn's towers caught the midday sun, gleaming with possibility. The woman they'd tried to bury had not only survived, she'd emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to grow something new from the ashes of the old order. The real work was just beginning. The Vermont countryside rolled past the car window in a blur of autumn colors. Isabella sat in the back of Blackwood's town car, her mother's diary clutched in her lap, as they wound their way through small towns toward the meeting that would complete another piece of her family puzzle. Margaret Morgan hasn't left Blue Hill Farm in 20 years, Blackwood explained, breaking the comfortable silence. After your grandfather chose his family's expectations over love, she retreated from society completely. But she never stopped watching or caring. Grace, who'd insisted on coming despite her hospital shift schedule, squeezed Isabella's hand. Did she know about us? All this time? She hired private investigators, Chris said from the front seat. Dad found out and started sending her updates, photos. She has a whole album of newspaper clippings about both of you. The car turned onto a gravel driveway lined with ancient maples. At its end stood a beautiful colonial farmhouse, its white paint pristine against the flaming backdrop of fall foliage. On the wraparound porch, an elegant woman with silver hair stood waiting, her posture straight despite her years. My girls, Margaret Morgan's voice trembled as they approached. My Elena's daughters. The embrace that followed broke something loose in Isabella's chest, a knot of tension she hadn't even known she was carrying. Her grandmother smelled of lavender and fresh bread, just like their mother had. Inside, over tea served in delicate cups that bore the Morgan family crest, Margaret shared the story Isabella had only known in pieces. How she'd fallen in love with Richard Morgan too when they were both young idealists. How his family's pressure and his father's manipulation had torn them apart. How Elena had been born in secret, given up for adoption to protect her from the Morgan family's toxic influence. But love finds a way, Margaret smiled, touching a photo of Elena as a young woman. Richard found her working in his building, recognized my eyes in her face. By then, he'd learned enough about power to know its price. He respected Elena's choice to raise you girls away from all that. Did Mom know? Grace asked. That he was our grandfather? At the end, Margaret nodded. They had a plan to tell you both, to make things right. Then Richard III discovered the truth. And Dad died before he could fix it, Chris finished grimly. But he left us everything we needed, Isabella said softly, thinking of the hidden files, the careful documentation. He gave us the weapons to fight back when we were ready. Margaret rose and left the room, returning with a worn leather portfolio. He left you more than that. This arrived last week from his lawyers. 25 years of letters he wrote but never sent. One for each of your birthdays, graduations, every major milestone. He was always watching, always proud. Isabella opened the portfolio with trembling fingers. The first letter was dated the day she'd gotten into Columbia Business School. My dearest granddaughter, today you proved what I've always known, that true strength comes from within, not from a family name. Tears blurred her vision as Grace read over her shoulder. Chris cleared his throat emotionally. There's something else, Margaret said. Richard, your father, he set up a trust. Not just money, but controlling interest in several key Morgan family holdings. He structured it to activate only if both Morgan brothers lost control of the company. Which, as of yesterday, has happened, Blackwood confirmed. Richard III's resignation triggered the transfer. Isabella, you and Grace now control 30% of Morgan and Reed's voting shares. The implications hit her like a wave. With the Reed family's offered shares and Blackwood's support, they could reshape the entire company. The prodigal granddaughter's return, Chris laughed. Wall Street won't know what hit it. Isabella's phone buzzed, a message from Sandra, emergency at Chun Global. Board meeting in an hour. Big news about Richard. Duty calls, Isabella sighed, standing reluctantly. But Margaret caught her hand. Stay, the older woman urged. Just for tonight. There's so much more to share, and... She hesitated. I'm selling Blue Hill Farm. Moving back to the city. If you'll have me, I'd like to be part of the Isabella Mitchell Foundation. Help other young women find their strength. We'd be honored, Grace said immediately, while Isabella nodded through tears. And perhaps, Margaret added with a twinkle in her eye, help you handle Richard. I did raise his father, after all. I know a thing or two about managing Morgan men. The emergency, it turned out, could wait until morning. They spent the evening on Margaret's porch, sharing stories as the sun set behind the Vermont hills. Isabella learned how her grandmother had built a successful organic farming cooperative, using her Morgan inheritance to help small farmers resist corporate takeovers. Fighting the system from the outside, Isabella mused, while we're changing it from within. Speaking of change, Chris checked his phone. Richard's press conference got picked up by every major network. Social media's calling it the Morgan Reformation. Hashtag Wall Street Justice is trending. He always did have a flair for drama. Grace rolled her eyes. Think he's really changed? People can surprise you, Margaret said softly. His father did. Sometimes it just takes losing everything to remember who you really are. Later that night, unable to sleep, Isabella wandered down to the farm's small lake. The moon cast silver ripples across its surface, reminiscent of the view from her old office. But here, surrounded by the land her grandmother had turned into a sanctuary, power felt different. Cleaner. More purposeful. Couldn't sleep either? Chris joined her by the water's edge. You know, Dad used to say the Morgan fortune was built on water, controlling ports, shipping lanes. But Grandmother built something better here. Something real. That's what we'll do, Isabella decided. Use the old power to build something new. The Isabella Mitchell Foundation, Chun Global's community programs, rehabilitating Morgan and Reed's reputation. The Reed kids want to meet, Chris mentioned. They're young, idealistic. Reminds me of us, before Wall Street got its hooks in. Isabella thought of Richard, of redemption, of bridges being rebuilt. Invite them to Brooklyn. To the flower shop. Let's start fresh, on our turf. Her phone lit up with another text from Sandra, found something in the old files. There's a pattern to the companies Reed and Richard targeted. All had something in common. They'd refused to sell to Morgan Industries 30 years ago, when your grandfather was trying to stop his father's aggressive expansion. They were punishing Dad's allies, Chris realized. Everyone who helped him try to change the company's direction. Then those are the first companies we help rebuild, Isabella declared. Full circle. Redemption for everyone. The moon slipped behind a cloud, leaving them in comfortable darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, board meetings, press conferences, family reunions, both sweet and difficult. But tonight, standing on her grandmother's land, Isabella felt the strength of both her inheritances, the Mitchell spirit of perseverance and the Morgan legacy of influence, finally united in one purpose. "Mom would have loved this place," Grace said, joining them with steaming mugs of cocoa. "All of it, the farm, grandmother, seeing us all together. She knew we'd find our way here," Isabella smiled, remembering her mother's words about storms and strength. "She just took the long road to make sure we'd be ready when we did." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnesses to cycles of loss and redemption, power and purpose, destruction and rebirth. The woman they tried to bury had not only survived, she'd uncovered a legacy greater than anyone could have imagined. And this was just the beginning. 1 month after the Vermont reunion, Grace's flower shop had been transformed into an unlikely war room. Maps and documents covered every surface, while the scent of roses mingled with coffee as Isabella led a meeting that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Around the wooden table sat an extraordinary gathering: Sandra Chen, representing Chen Global's interests; James Blackwood, his corporate raider persona softened by genuine commitment to change; the three Reed siblings, eager to reshape their father's legacy; Chris Morgan, coordinating their legal strategy; and Richard Morgan III, still awkward in this humble setting but trying visibly to adapt. The Isabella Mitchell Foundation has identified 23 companies that were targeted by Reed and Richard's operation, Isabella explained, pinning markers on a map of the country. "Thanks to Grandmother Morgan's connections in sustainable agriculture, we've already started rebuilding 6 of them. The SEC has frozen most of Dad's hidden assets," Elizabeth Reed, the eldest of Thomas Reed's children, added. "We're proposing to convert them into a restoration fund for the affected families." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "The board is concerned about the scale of these reparations. They're talking about shareholder obligations." "Let them talk," Margaret Morgan's voice cut in as she entered the shop, bringing a fresh wave of autumn air with her. Since moving back to New York, she'd become a powerful ally, her old society connections proving invaluable. "I've been speaking with your mother, Richard. She's agreed to support our proposals at the next shareholders' meeting." Isabella watched her half-brother's face carefully. Richard's journey from antagonist to reluctant ally had been difficult, marked by moments of genuine remorse and occasional backsliding into old habits of privilege. "The Morgan name needs this," Chris reminded him gently. "Dad knew it 25 years ago. That's why he tried to stop the company's predatory practices." "Speaking of names," Sandra interjected, "Chen Global's board has approved the merger proposal. We can announce it whenever you're ready, Isabella." The merger had been Sandra's idea, combining Chen Global's technical innovation with the reformed Morgan and Reed's financial power and Blackwood's market expertise. The new entity would be called Mitchell Global Partners, a name that honored both Isabella's mothers, Isabella Mitchell, and the corporate culture that had raised her. "There's something else," Grace spoke up, entering from the back room with a dusty metal box. "Remember how Mom used to volunteer at that literacy center in the Bronx? Well, I found her old files. She was developing a program to teach financial literacy to underprivileged kids. She had everything planned out, just never had the resources to implement it." Isabella's throat tightened with emotion. Even now, their mother's vision was helping shape the future. "That's perfect for the Foundation's education initiative," Margaret beamed. "Elena always did think 3 steps ahead." "Like mother, like daughter," Blackwood commented, nodding at Isabella. "Your handling of the press has been masterful. The public loves a redemption story, especially one with such powerful women at its heart." Indeed, the media had seized on the narrative, the secret granddaughter rising from betrayal to reform Wall Street, aided by her grandmother's wisdom and her mother's legacy. The New York Times had run a feature just yesterday, "The Mitchell Revolution: How 2 Generations of Women Are Changing Corporate America." "We're not just changing narratives," Isabella reminded them. "We're changing lives." Miguel Rodriguez's tech training program has already placed 50 students in IT positions. Mrs. Rodriguez's community advocacy group is helping small businesses navigate predatory lending practices. The Rodriguez Family Small Business Center, Richard mused. "Still can't believe I'm funding something in Brooklyn." "Believe it, brother," Grace grinned. "Welcome to the right side of history." A knock at the shop's door interrupted them. Mike Peterson entered, looking excited. They found it, the original Morgan Industries ethical business charter, from when the company was founded. It was in the old building's cornerstone. Chris took the yellowed document reverently. Dad used to talk about this. His grandfather wrote it, but it was buried when the company went public. Success without soul is failure in disguise, Richard read over his shoulder, his voice thoughtful. Grandfather Morgan wrote that? The same principles Elena taught her daughters, Margaret said softly. Perhaps some truths run in the blood, even when we don't know our own history. Isabella stood, moving to the shop's window. Outside, Brooklyn streets were coming alive with morning traffic. Across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez was opening her cafe, now expanded with help from the foundation. Young tech students hurried to Miguel's classes in the renovated community center. A film crew was setting up to interview Elizabeth Reed about the restoration fund. We've come so far, she murmured. Grace joined her at the window. Remember what Mom used to say about gardens? The most beautiful blooms come from soil that's been turned over, where old things have been allowed to decay and feed the new. Isabella turned back to the gathered group, family by blood and by choice, all committed to nurturing something new from the ashes of the old system. Richard caught her eye and nodded slightly, acknowledging how far they'd all come from that brutal betrayal in the Morgan and Reed boardroom. The merger announcement goes out tomorrow, Sandra reminded them. Mitchell Global Partners will be official by market open. And the foundation launches its first major initiatives next week, Elizabeth added. The Reed Family Scholarship Fund, the Morgan Mitchell Business Ethics Program. Don't forget the most important announcement, Margaret smiled. The Blue Hill Farm Institute for Sustainable Business, opening next spring in Vermont. Isabella felt tears threatening as she looked at the faces around her. The woman they tried to bury had not only survived, she'd grown into something far more powerful than they could have imagined. Not a single corporate warrior, but the heart of a movement, supported by a family that bridged old wealth and new values, Wall Street and Brooklyn, power and purpose. Together, she said softly, raising her coffee cup. For Mom, for Dad, and for everyone who needs a chance to rise. Together, they echoed, and in that moment, Isabella saw the future clearly, not an empire built on destruction, but a garden where everyone could grow, nourished by the very soil that had once been meant as her grave. Outside, the Brooklyn sun climbed higher, promising another day of possibility and redemption. 1 year to the day after Isabella Mitchell's dramatic fall from grace at Morgan and Reed, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel buzzed with anticipation. The occasion, the official launch gala of the Elena Mitchell Foundation, combined with the first quarter celebrations of Mitchell Global Partners' historic success. Isabella stood before the mirror in a private suite, adjusting her mother's gold necklace. The woman who looked back at her was both familiar and transformed, still the fighter from Brooklyn, but now carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she came from. Ready? Grace appeared in the doorway, resplendent in emerald green. Everyone's waiting. And wait till you see who just arrived. The ballroom fell silent as Isabella descended the grand staircase, flanked by Grace and Margaret Morgan. At the bottom, Richard Morgan III waited with an unexpected guest, his mother, Catherine Morgan, making her first public appearance since the scandal broke. Isabella, dear, Catherine stepped forward, her aristocratic features softened with genuine emotion. I should have done this months ago. She embraced her stepdaughter publicly, drawing appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Richard Sr. would be so proud of what you've built. Of what you've helped our son become. Richard, looking uncomfortable but determined in his tuxedo, cleared his throat. The latest numbers from the Restoration Fund, he murmured, passing Isabella a tablet. We've exceeded projections by 40%. Because you finally learned to listen to the right people, Chris teased, joining them with Sandra Chen and James Blackwood. The lights dimmed, and Isabella took her place at the podium. Below her, the faces told a story of transformation. The Reed siblings, now running their own ethical investment firm, Miguel Rodriguez, heading Mitchell Global's cybersecurity division, Mrs. Rodriguez, recently appointed to the foundation's community advisory board, and dozens of recipients of their various initiatives, from small business owners to scholarship students. 1 year ago, Isabella began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. I stood in another building, watching everything I'd worked for crumble around me. But what looked like an ending was really a beginning. Sometimes, life buries us not to destroy us, but to show us what we're truly made of. She gestured to the massive screens behind her, where photos began to appear. Elena Mitchell in her early days as a housekeeper, Richard Morgan II secretly supporting community projects, Margaret Morgan's sustainable farming initiatives, and finally, the new Mitchell Global Partners headquarters, a revolutionary green building in Brooklyn, not Manhattan. The Elena Mitchell Foundation was born from a simple truth my mother taught me: real power comes not from what you can take, but from what you can give. In our first year, we've launched 37 community programs, funded 1,500 scholarships, and helped restore 23 families to businesses that were wrongfully taken from them. Richard stepped forward then, taking his place beside her at the podium. And through Mitchell Global Partners, we're proving that ethical business isn't just morally right, it's profitable. Our first quarter returns have set new industry standards. But numbers tell only part of the story, Isabella continued. The real measure of our success lies in the lives we've touched, the communities we've helped rebuild, and the values we're passing on to the next generation. The screen shifted to show the groundbreaking at the Blue Hill Farm Institute, where Margaret Morgan stood with a group of young business students, teaching them about sustainable corporate practices. Next came footage of the Rodriguez Family Small Business Center, where former Wall Street executives volunteered to help local entrepreneurs. Tonight, we're announcing our biggest initiative yet, Isabella revealed. The Mitchell Morgan Fellowship for Corporate Reform. 100 young leaders will be trained in ethical business practices, then placed in companies across the country. And our first corporate partner in this venture? Blackwood Financial, James announced, joining them at the podium. It's time for the old guard to learn from the new. As applause filled the room, Isabella felt a familiar presence. In her mind's eye, she saw her mother watching with pride, perhaps standing beside Richard Morgan II, both of them seeing their dreams of ethical business finally taking root. Grace squeezed her hand as the celebrations continued around them. Mom would love this. All of it. She's here, Margaret said softly, joining her granddaughters. In every life we've helped change, in every student we've supported, in every business we've helped save. The evening wore on, a testament to the power of redemption and renewal. Richard was deep in conversation with the Reed siblings about expanding their restoration efforts internationally. Chris and Sandra were discussing new tech initiatives with Miguel. Catherine Morgan was actually laughing at one of Mrs. Rodriguez's stories. Later, Isabella slipped away to the hotel's terrace, needing a moment alone. The New York skyline sparkled before her, but her gaze was drawn to Brooklyn, where it all began. Quite a view, a familiar voice said. Thomas Reed, permitted to attend under supervision as part of his cooperation agreement, stood in the doorway. Quite a change, Isabella replied carefully. I've had a lot of time to think, Reed said quietly. Your mother. Elena came to me once, years ago. Told me I was losing my soul to power. I should have listened. It's never too late to change, Isabella offered. Your children are proof of that. Reed nodded, then hesitated. There's something you should have. He handed her an old photograph. Your parents. The day they met. I kept it all these years, not sure why. The photo showed Elena Mitchell, young and beautiful in her housekeeper's uniform, looking up at Richard Morgan II with a smile that would shape generations. They stood in the old building's lobby, unaware they were being photographed, caught in a moment of pure connection. Thank you, Isabella whispered, but Reed had already gone. She returned to the ballroom just as Margaret was calling for attention. A toast, her grandmother announced, to the woman they tried to bury. The woman who grew instead. To Isabella, the crowd echoed. But Isabella raised her own glass to the photographs now displayed behind her, her mother, her father, all those who had fought for change before her. To all of us, she corrected. To every seed that refuses to die, every root that grows deeper, every bloom that breaks through concrete. To change that comes from within and strength that comes from below. To the garden we're growing together. As the celebration continued around her, Isabella Mitchell, daughter of Elena, granddaughter of Margaret and Richard II, sister to Grace and Richard III, ally to many, knew that this wasn't really an ending. It was, as her mother would have said, just another season in the endless cycle of growth and renewal. The woman they had tried to bury had become a forest, spreading seeds of change across the concrete canyons of Wall Street and the brownstone streets of Brooklyn alike. And in that forest, something new and beautiful was growing, nourished by the very forces that had once tried to destroy it. This was her true inheritance, not money or power or even justice, but the ability to transform darkness into light, endings into beginnings, and buried hopes into blooming realities. The night sparkled on, full of promise and possibility, as the stars wheeled overhead and the city hummed below, and somewhere, surely, Elena Mitchell smiled.